introduce who we are. I'm, again, Rebecca Mendiola from Collective Impact Solutions. Some of you might know me from Santa Clara County Office of Education, as well as the San Diego County Office of Ed. I'm going to turn it over to Tia Martinez and Rhonda Beasley as well.
Rhonda, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So Rhonda Beasley, I recognize some familiar faces as well. I am the multi-tiered system of support coordinator from the Santa Clara County Office of Education, where I work with districts to help them build up their system of support, linking academics and behavior and social emotional learning.
Great, thank you. It's great to see all you, to have everyone's cameras on and see your faces. I'm going to talk a little bit about the school to prison pipeline and how this issue is an issue for schools, but that it moves beyond that, okay? And talk a little bit about the challenges we face. Let's see. Could I ask, would it be possible to not make me a host because all the admins are coming up on my screen? The other Tia? Or is there a way to get that off because they're distracting? But I will power forward while you try to figure that out. But I want to begin with kind of the basics, right? And this is all a teaser for the masterclass. The masterclass is going to go much greater depth around all of this. So this is what we know from the research about what the kind of negative feedback loop is that comprises the school to prison pipeline, okay? You have a student is suspended, okay? Now, when that student is suspended, we know that you get less of supervised time, right? Learning time, and that means you fall behind. And you also have less time with other kids who are learning, other kids there, teachers who are trained, so you end up disengaged, okay? So what we do is we had an amazing study out of Texas that is probably about 6 or 7 years old, followed something like 5 million fifth graders all the way into their 20s. And what this study allowed us to do is it allowed us to take one kid and match them with another kid, just like them, and not just in terms of that kid being the same, the kid having the same grades, the same test scores, the same behavioral history, right? But also that kid going to the same type of school with the same amount of certificated teachers. It involved kids having the same family background. You could match it on, they matched it on, I believe, 70 different variables. And then they moved forward. So what they could do is take one kid who got suspended and take another kid just like that kid who didn't get suspended, and then they watched what happened. What they found is that the kid who got suspended was twice as likely as the kid who was just like him, but didn't get suspended, twice as likely to have to repeat a grade, and twice as likely to drop out. Now, when you get suspended, you get less learning time. What do you get more of? Okay, you get more unsupervised time, all right? So you get more unsupervised time in public spaces, and this is going to lead to increased exposure to two things: community violence and police ICE enforcement, okay? And if you're spending more time out there in the community without adult supervision, and you are risking, you're risking arrest, right? You're going to be in neighborhoods that are heavily policed, all right? And the same survey I talked about, the one that was able to match on the 70 factors out of Texas, well, the other big finding from it is when they compared the kid who got suspended to the kid just like them who didn't get suspended, the kid who got suspended was also 3 times as likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. Now, this is not self-report. This is what they got all this data by matching administrative data across. So they were 3 times as likely to end up in the juvenile justice system database. We also know that this is the traditional route, right? You get pushed out of school, you're unsupervised in the community, you get arrested, right? But we also know that you can go directly from school to incarceration and to arrest. That's because over the last 20 years, we've seen an explosion, really actually 25 to 30, in school police, okay? And the issue with school police is it just happens to be a really difficult developmental fit, right? Like, because the police are there enforcing the law and teenagers are there doing their job. Teenagers' job developmentally is to push back, right? And teachers and youth development workers understand that, right? But when teenagers are acting just developmentally appropriate and you push back against a police officer, that can be an arrestable offense. So we just have a terrible mismatch. And then once you're arrested, it sort of breaks whatever tenuous graphs you have to the education system. Okay, first you're going to change districts, right? You're going to go into whatever the court schools are. Okay, and what this does is you go into a different school system, and when you leave, you have to come back and reconnect. And that reconnecting can be incredibly difficult, right? It can be really, really hard. For years, we had lawyers talking about kids would get out of school and try to re-enroll and be denied enrollment, right? Because now the kid has this kind of scarlet letter on them as a bad kid, and the schools don't want them. So you have to try. So you have enough grit, you keep on trying and trying and trying. By the time you do get back in school, you're probably going to end up in an alternative school or a community day school, okay? And what does that mean? So first, I just want to cite the literature here. Juvenile detention and incarceration increases the chance of dropping out of high school from a 1 in 10 chance to a 1 in 4 chance. If you have the grit to keep trying and re-enroll, you end up in alternative school. By this time in the pipeline, you've lost a lot of learning time. You've been to multiple schools. You've been locked up with other kids who are in trouble, right? You actually need more learning time. You need more adult time, not less. And so you go to a school which in the ed code says that you just less seat time's required, right? You're going to be sent home with packets, right? You're going to be put on low quality credit recovery. You're going to get less adult time. And when you are at this point, kind of in the cycle, when I'm in person and we can talk, I usually ask, like, how do you think this young person's feeling at this point? You can imagine feeling like the world is not a particularly great, fair place, right? They're caught in a system that keeps on dragging them down and down, right? So do you think, feeling like you have a bit of a chip on your shoulder, you're back in your alternative school, you're at your continuation or your community day school, and your teacher says, Miss So-and-so, take off that cap, right? What do you think you're going to do in that headset, right? What do you think you're going to do in that mindset? Are you going to escalate or de-escalate? You're going to escalate, right? And what happens when you escalate? You get suspended from school. So this is the cycle, and we move around and around in it, right? And it makes it overwhelmingly likely that by the time you hit 18, two things have happened. The first is that you will have dropped out of high school. And dropping out of high school doubles to quadruples the probability of going to prison. Second thing is you will have experienced juvenile incarceration. And we know that juvenile incarceration increases the likelihood of going to prison from a 1 in 10 chance to a 1 in 3 chance. This is the bridge, okay? So this is the school to prison pipeline. Now, the question then is, what can we do to stop it, right? And I think this is the very high level summary, right? The first thing we can do is we can stop suspending kids. We don't have any evidence that suspending kids has any educational value, and we do have evidence that it causes harm. Okay. In its place, we can do a variety of things that involve transforming school climate and culture and connecting youth and families to services. So this looks like MTSS. This looks like PBIS. There's a ton of changes that happen at the school level that we'll go over more in the master class. But that's what schools need to do. Okay, but we also have other systems that are implicated in this pipeline, and we need them to be doing things as well, right? So the first thing is we need to remove police from schools, all right? We need to transform policing practices and scale youth development systems. So listen, we're worried about kids who get a 2-day suspension, but every kid is out of school by 3:30, and most parents aren't going to be home till 6:30 or 7, right? And we have all summers off. Right? We need to have this rich array of youth development developments of all the stuff that schools used to do before kind of standards-based reform sucked it out. The arts, sports, all of that stuff needs to come in, and that has to be the county and the city stepping up. So you need the municipal police stepping up, you need the city stepping up, you need the county stepping up. Then if you do all this, you will really see a huge decrease in arrests. okay? But you're still gonna see arrests, all right? And the juvenile justice system is gonna take time to change, right? So what we need to make sure we're doing, because unfortunately what we know about the justice system, the deeper you go in it, it's what's called criminogenic. It produces crime, right? So we want to do everything we can from keeping young people from getting further into that. So pre-adjudication diversion means taking almost everyone, and certainly everyone. Right now we lock up young people with misdemeanors. Every misdemeanor should be diverted. And by diversion, I'm not talking about like, instead of getting locked up, you're going to go to drug treatment. I don't mean that. I mean diversion before booking. This is called pre-adjudication diversion, okay? Then if you do that, you still have young people who do very serious stuff, right? What we know here is that youth incarceration doesn't work, all right? Like I said, it's criminogenic. We need to find another way to deal with violent crime among young people. We need to scale community-based alternatives to incarceration. Big congregate incarceration isn't what works for chronic violent offenders. And then finally, we need to redesign the alternative school system, right? So this at a very high level gets to, 3 of these boxes here are school boxes. The rest are really justice boxes, city boxes, county boxes, right? But I'm gonna say that actually you need to even go further upstream. This is the bare minimum requirements, but you're still not really getting deep to the root. Let's take it back there. Here we are with the student suspension. Now we're moving more upstream, okay? I want to say that at the root of a lot of what we're experiencing are racially and economically segregated neighborhoods and schools that have been chronically underinvested in, right? In which opportunity is severely limited, okay? In those neighborhoods, what you have is concentrations of things like this, of family poverty. And that can look like multiple low-wage jobs or chronic joblessness. You have unstable housing, family homelessness. You have racial discrimination in housing, in employment, in education. You have violence. When you concentrate things like poverty, when you take a lot of folks who are suffering, they're poor, they're unstably housed, they face pervasive racial discrimination, and you put them all in one geographic space. You concentrate them in these neighborhoods, you get violence. You get violence on the street, and you get violence in communities. On top of that, we'll also have to deal with what we're seeing so viscerally right now, which is the very force that's supposed to come in and stem the violence creates more violence. So these neighborhoods are what we call over-policed and underprotected. So you have a lot of aggressive enforcement of minor misdemeanors, broken windows policing, right? But because of the relationship and brutality of the police force to the community, people aren't willing to cooperate. And the fact of the matter is most crimes are solved because people tell, they drop a dime, right? So no one's gonna tell, right? So what you get is, if you're in these neighborhoods, you're at once, you're over-policed, and if you get hurt, if you get murdered, your crime is actually less likely to be solved than in others. And then we have a huge impact of parental incarceration and immigrant detention. So we also have families where the parent is gone, is locked up in detention, is locked up in prison, and missing. Now, all of this creates toxic stress and trauma across generations. What it creates are profoundly fragile families dealing with tons and tons and tons of stressors. And toxic stress, we know, and I'm not going to go in deep with this, I think in the next little teaser session, Rebecca and Rhonda will talk more about this, but the toxic stress and trauma has a direct impact on child development and behavior, okay? If you are in a chronic stress response, right, your amygdala is sending a cascade of stress hormones, your prefrontal cortex, which does all that great self-regulation, is shutting down. All that's getting energy, all that's getting exercise, because the brain is like a muscle, right, is your fear-flight response, right? This is really impacting. It's like you had an overdeveloped, a hypervigilant system they're on threat, okay? And an underdeveloped one, doesn't make sense for you to be like, oh, I'm going to be really thoughtful and really think hard and do a cost-benefit analysis of whether I should, run away or attack that. Like, if you did that in dangerous environments, you would be dead. So that part isn't necessary when you're in stress response, but that means that part isn't getting energy, isn't getting exercise. And this impact is direct, but it's also indirect in that, remember, families are dealing with this across generations, okay? And the cumulative impact on parental mental and physical health is absolutely profound, okay? And when parents are dealing with economic, mental, physical health issues in an intergenerational way, you often see child abuse and neglect. So the indirect path is both parents' depression, parents' substance abuse, parents' mental health issues, and neglect and abuse also impact the child's development, okay? So this is everything that's happening before the kid gets to the school, to the door of the school, right? Then they go into the door of the school, right? And they have these sets of behaviors and these sets of needs. And they are going to encounter providers. And we're not going to do a big dive on implicit bias, but I'm just going to say that there's research that shows that Black children in particular, okay, the same behavior in a Black child and a white child is understood to be more aggressive in the Black child, is perceived as more aggressive and threatening than in the white child. And this study specifically controlled for explicit bias. So these weren't explicitly racist folks, okay? These were teachers, and this happened across race. So all of this is happening outside, and it implies that we actually need a response that's even greater than just, youth development, police, and juvenile justice, okay? This is the additional pieces that are going to need to step up here. Oops, sorry. No. Oops. Okay, now I have subtitles. Don't know how to turn off, but now I have subtitles. So first thing we're going to need are income and job supports, right? We're going to need rental subsidies and affordable housing, right? We're going to need violence prevention and interruption. We're going to need a different way of understanding public safety, where more safety doesn't equal increased policing, where more safety equals public health, where more safely equals community wellness. And we need to think about what I'm calling family entry and reentry supports. And then what we're also going to need is a comprehensive healing systems and supports. And by that, we mean healthcare for all, right? So all of those parents struggling under the weight of trauma, they need help. And then on the child abuse and neglect, we need new approaches by child welfare, like differential response, which is instead of investigating and saying, oh, this doesn't rise to taking you away, right? We're going to go away. You figure out how you can get community groups in there to help early. So push this back earlier so you're preventing, as opposed to just waiting till it gets so bad that you have to do something. And then taking the child away. And then for children's behavioral stuff, we actually have a wealth of resources that are untapped. The early and periodic screening, diagnostic, and treatment, EPSDT, is part of Medi-Cal. And it's a very broad children's mental health benefit, right? We have First Five, we have preschool. All of them would be needing to work with this. And then finally, we have these three that I left in red, okay? Because these three in red, they're a big deal. They're more than just, oh, we need you to do these programs, okay? What I'm going to argue is that the change that we need to see if we're going to shift racially and economically segregated neighborhoods and schools that have been like that for centuries at this point, we're going to need to shift power, policies, resource, and culture in a big way. And honestly, that's what part of what's happening right now in the streets is a movement to shift those. So I'm calling it PPRC, right? Shift PPRC. And then over here, the last one on that implicit bias, there definitely are some effective training programs. It's going to take a combination, though, of training and PPRC. This is the challenge, though. So this is the challenge we face. We have, over the last 50 years, saw a huge increase in family needs and a decrease in family resources, right? So this is, we could talk about the increase in single parent families, but let's just focus on the job market. Like, we don't have well-paying jobs for people with a high school degree or less. People have to work more than one job. People don't literally have the time for their kids. And often you only have one parent, not two parents. In the face of that need, some interesting stuff happened, in particular in California. California did it first, and then the rest of the nation did it. But we've had 50 years now of divestment in the social safety net. Do people know who that is? That's Howard Jarvis. That's Proposition 13. Proposition 13 was the first of many reforms around taxation based on this idea that sort of government money is wasteful. What this resulted in is a gutting of social services, a gutting of education. And then Reagan brought it to the nation. What he's presenting here is a cut in the highest marginal tax rate, I think from 28 to, I forget what it went down, 28 to some 13%, I forget exactly. But what happened is when you lower taxes like that, right, the government has less revenue. What that meant is all of us who are in service systems have been over 2 generations now, 50 years, right? We've been scrambling to try to deal with more needs that families are bringing into schools and into us on less money. And then finally, at the same time that we were pulling tax dollars out of the social safety net, where were we putting money? We were putting money in investment, punishment, and incarceration. And this is 3 strikes. So this was the challenge, okay? This is the challenge that we face. Now, what happened in the face of this challenge, or one of our analyses, is that schools, first of all, everyone had to deal with austerity. And this austerity is only going to get greater in the face of COVID, right? Where everyone's dealing with huge, huge, huge budget cuts, right? But in the face of austerity, schools felt overburdened. They had these kids coming with all of those upstream things that they needed to deal with. And it was overwhelming. What they began to try to do is kind of be like what I consider a Band-Aid in a broken social safety net. So you got a big social safety net that really covered tons and tons of things in the 70s. It gets worn away, right? And so then schools are like, oh, well, why don't we put a health center in the school? Right? I know, we'll have like a connection to emergency hotel rooms for homeless parents. So schools began to try to do this. But the thing is that it was an insufficient Band-Aid. It was an insufficient Band-Aid. And as soon as money got cut, those were the first things to go. Also, this isn't the stuff that schools were good at. And there actually were a bunch of other agencies and other sectors that are much better at that, right? But they remained completely separate. And when they tried to come together, schools and child welfare and public health, they tried again and again. It proved incredibly difficult. What we're saying is our challenge now is we would like to see the school system move from Band-Aid to backbone. What do we mean by that? That instead of trying to replicate the social safety net without sort of the funding or expertise, how can the school be kind of that backbone into which all the other services connect and flow? How can we create a way to build up a robust social safety net again, right? Through building up and fully funding the range of services and then figuring out how to connect them through schools, because we have no other service that is universal like that and that sees kids and families every day. And that is the end of the presentation. I'll hand it back to Rebecca.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much. That was amazing. I don't know how many times I've actually watched Tia present, and she just amazes me every single time. What you heard from Tia was really just a snippet of the presentations that she provides. Many times she provides 90 minutes to 2 hours. We wanted to be able to give you the opportunity to ask questions and of Tia, but also note that Again, this was a snippet of her presentation. There is a two-part series of the work that of the second part that we're going to be providing to you on June 16th is really the how-to. So Tia talked about the schools being the backbone, really us moving in a direction of bringing all the county agencies and all the government entities to really begin to align our work, making sure that our families and our children are at the center of the work. So on June 16th, you'll hear Rhonda, myself, Tia, also Tiffany Gibson, many of you guys know her from California After School Network, really talk about how do we work differently. Again, now is the time to be able to have a conversation and really think about how we shift our work and how do we change the system. We've been perpetuating the school to prison pipeline. We continue the cycle in intergenerational cycle of disadvantaged families, but what are we going to do to be able to make the shift and make the change? So we'll give you, we'll be able to present to you on June 16th a little bit of what we are doing in a county system right now in the Bay Area to be able to provide that support across a large system, bringing folks together to begin to dismantle the school to prison pipeline and eliminate the intergenerational cycle of disadvantaged families. So I'm going to hand it over to Rhonda so we can begin the conversations and the questions.
So I want to encourage you all. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Tia. Again, always great. I will echo Rebecca. I don't know how many times I have watched you. I've watched your video, had my husband watch your video. I learn something new every time. So thank you. I want to encourage everyone to please add your questions to the chat box. Again, Tia is here. So this is the time to take advantage of her and ask as many questions. We do have one. When you propose the idea of all of the services within the school, the question comes, wouldn't money going to the schools for those other services take it away from organizations that focus on those other services, for example, mental health or services for children experiencing homelessness?
That's a great question, Cynthia, and it'll help us to get clear because we're actually saying the opposite, which is the money shouldn't, all of the money definitely shouldn't go to the schools. So the schools, instead of the schools trying to rebuild those services that are provided by the mental health department and all of its contractors, all of its community groups, they have a way that they can hook in and work with the schools, right? So the idea is less rebuild everything inside the schools and give everything to the school system. It's how do we move collectively across departments, across community agencies to get into schools and to get into families such that we're addressing these issues upstream. So we're looking more at prevention and healing upstream. What we do right now is we pass the buck, right? Because no one has enough resources to deal with it. People are flustered. You're trying to do too much with too little until it gets really, really bad. And then we bring in the punitive, expensive stuff. So no, in fact, this won't work without rebuilding up mental health services, rebuilding up. Like schools are good at some things, but providing mental health stuff is that you need to bring in the people who provide mental health. That expertise needs to be brought in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and thank you for that, Tia. And as we will talk in next week, it's that those services are then brought in a systemic way and a systematic way, right? Because we want to do away with agencies just trying to get into the school with no comprehensive way of how the services are provided to the families and the students most in need, as opposed to what's currently happening where we have everyone kind of relying on personal relationships to get in and work with families. And then we have many children and families who don't receive the services. Another question that came up from Maya, is there any policy work happening on getting rid of truancy laws that get families and kids into the system?
That is a great question. That yes, there is policy work happening, but we still have a ways to go. This should be happening across states. So the criminalization of truancy, right? Anything that's pulling kids and families, right, into the justice system early on when it isn't something that is a real deep threat to public safety needs to be reversed. That's really important. And some of that, so there's state law, right? But then there's also how your DA enforces it, Okay, so we kind of moved from a truancy model to a chronic absence model, right? Let's make sure we don't take the criminal enforcement part of truancy into chronic absence. So I've worked with districts that are like, okay, we want to get our chronic absence, we're going to put the school police in charge of that, right? Like we just talked about, the massive impact of mass incarceration on these families. So many families are impacted by the justice system. Having a police officer show up and knock on the door is probably not the best way to engage them, right? So it's a great question, and the move towards chronic absence is the right direction, but we do need to get those truancy laws off the books, and we need to make sure that you don't have aggressive enforcement of that in your localities, and you're not relying on the police and probation to address chronic absence.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Katie. As you present this work to schools, do you find that school leadership is enthusiastic about being a backbone or hesitant to expand their responsibilities relative to other agencies?
That's a great question. I'm going to I'll give my answer, but then I'm going to put it back on Rhonda and Rebecca, okay? I think there's ambivalence, right? I think you hit on it, right? So yeah, they are hesitant, right, about systems are incredibly leery of one another, right? And so there is really the school system can sometimes function like, water off a duck's back. So there's a tendency in educational culture to be like, you know what, just wait it out, it'll pass. Right? Like there's going to be this new thing. And so some school systems are responding like that. Some of them don't. To collaborate means that you have to cede some control, and that can be really, really hard. On the other hand, we have been hearing unrelenting over the last 20 years, how can you expect teachers in the education system to deal with all the issues that are being brought in, right? We hear that over and over and over again, right? And the fact is they can't. So we need to figure out how we bring folks together to create a coherent system. I'm going to pass it back to Rhonda and Rebecca.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
I was just ditto what Tia said. I think what we're moving towards in the education system is really to help school districts build out their infrastructure around their system. And I think that, again, it goes back to what Tia continues to say in every single presentation, that we can't do it alone. And I think many times what happens, especially with the school to prison pipeline, is we rely on the school to be able to provide the supports to our kids, our students, our families, to be able to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. And like Tia said, it takes all of us, a collective effort to do this. If the schools know that we have an alignment or a system in which we all can work within, they're going to be more willing to be able to work together and provide levels of supports. I always say that school sites are the pivotal unit of change. Every single county agency has funding to be able to provide services upstream, prevention, to our schools. But the thing is we can't rely on the school alone to do the work. And I think this is why the effort in which Tia continues to talk about is, how do we bring us all together, and how do we begin to work within a system? How do we change the way we work? What do we do differently?
Yeah, and again, just building off of what you both said, we know that the school is the pivotal unit of change everyone wants in, and that actually creates a problem in and of itself. So what I alluded to earlier, you have everyone trying to get into the school, oftentimes based on personal relationships, or a person who just has a desire to just kind of go off and do what they think is right in the best interest of the students and families they serve. all well-intentioned. The problem is when people move on to other positions, now the agency that's working with that school now has to start over and rebuild personal relationships. So a lot of the work we have started is really helping our districts to build the infrastructure so we're focusing on the system and not personal relationships. If we really want to make a change, then we have to make this embedded. It's kind of like the PPRC that Tia alluded to earlier, right? It has to be part of your policies, your practices. It has to just be the way we function. And that's really how we would help to build up the capacity of the school to support this work and to partner with the agencies. Another question, and Rebecca, you added this, if you maybe could complete it. It says, was the lottery money supposed to go to schools too? And I wasn't sure. I know you added it from a participant, but wasn't sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I was given the question as well. You could
Okay,
go to.
maybe what was the lottery money supposed to do for schools, Tia, if you know?
I actually don't know. Not all of it goes to school. A proportion of it goes to schools. And when you look at it, I think it ends up being, I just looked at this a couple days ago. I forget what percent. It's not a huge amount. Like, remember, like the school system funding the school system is by far the biggest chunk of a state budget, right? And it's different from state to state. In California, most of the money actually comes from things like the lottery in the state. In other states, we have folks here from other states, you might have something that's more kind of linked to local property taxes, but about 75% of our money comes from the state. So yes, but the lottery is a piece that helps, but I don't know the specific details if there are sort of limits on what that can be spent on.
Great, thank you. Another question, are there community organizations that you recommend we partner with to further the creation of the backbone and strengthening of the safety net? From Estrella.
Okay, say that again. I'm looking, could you say that
again?
Are
there,
yeah.
Do you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Are there community organizations that you recommend we partner with to further the creation of the backbone and strengthening of the safety net?
Yes. Let's see, I don't even know where to start on that. There's a ton, right? So you're going to need to have alliances with groups who are advocating for shifts in taxation policy, right? So Schools and Communities First in California is on the ballot. It changes the split roll tax in Prop 13, the tax on business properties. It'll have a huge impact. So part of strengthening the safety net is going to be really changes in state and local policy around taxation, and then how those monies go out. So that part of it is making sure that you're connected to those efforts. But then locally, right, how you find the groups. Obviously the leadership of all the county departments need to be involved. But then you also need to think hard, because most of the services aren't delivered directly through the county. They're through contractors, which are nonprofits, okay? Which means then you have a huge network of nonprofits that you also are going to need to work with to align to be able to access and partner with your school system. And so in that, I think, making sure you have at the table the big multi-service providers, right, that are getting grants. They have units of service they need to fill, right? So you want them, you want the system leaders, and then really importantly, if you can get parent advocate groups in, okay? So there are groups like Cadre in South LA, Plan in Oakland, right? Groups that organize parents to advocate for their communities and their young people. Like, you need those folks at the table too, because the family needs to be at the center of this. And then there's a huge range of intermediaries that do different work around collective impact and can help folks to structure the backbone. Those are the things that come off. I have a question for folks. What's Learn? So many people are from it.
Should we respond in the chat, or?
Yeah, or you can just tell me.
Yeah.
Does someone from Learn want to share, or should I share? I can just jump in. It's that we're a nonprofit that provides services to students before and after school, and through the form of after-school programs, summer programs, and partners closely with districts in the greater LA area to accomplish that.
Right
So
on.
several, staff members are on.
Essential, like the family resource centers and after school and before school, absolutely essential. And you can think also, those are all part of the kind of Band-Aid we've tried to create, right? As our economy shifted and you no longer had one parent who was staying home and the other one who was working, all of this changed, but it's like our social safety net didn't keep up. It actually went the opposite direction. So we have, so we need after school, we need before school now, we need, but you all are such an absolutely essential piece across the school year and through the summer. So it's super exciting to see all the Learn folks here. Right on.
All right, thank you. The next question, Tia, builds off of what you started to talk about. This one is very specific to parent partnerships.
Right
so it asks, are there any models of parent partnerships with school districts that advocate for family needs within school systems? And this is being asked by Elizabeth.
Within school systems, like specific, like about, could the person actually unmute themselves and just say a little bit more about the question?
Sure. Hi, Tia.
Hey, good to see you.
You too. We talked about this real briefly at another meeting we had at the OV in
Yes.
San Jose. I think I keep going back to parent partnerships to really, when you talked earlier about that, we need groups, right, outside of the district,
Exactly.
right? We need folks to come in and advocacy groups. And I keep going back to this a type of parent partnership model where they are actually at the table at the district level, having conversations,
Yes.
being able to bring to the table what is actually going on in the family's needs within their districts, right? And then strategizing how to, instead of, like you talked about, keeping the kids out of the schools or not having a pathway back into school, right? What can we do as parents to partner with the school? I think I think community voice and parent partnerships in this process will be very essential, because then people are going to be making decisions about what families and parents needs, but without hearing what they're saying. And
Exactly.
I think overall we all know that's been very detrimental, systemic wise, in the nation. So,
thank you, Elizabeth. That's powerful. Remember, like, the idea of this backbone and kind of the one single system is that instead of the system's needs being primary, it's the family's needs. Okay. Now, everything we can all be as wonderful with our big hearts and our good intentions, but in the end, bureaucracies tend towards their own furthering their own existence. So, in other words, you need to have co-governance with families. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, like, so we have advocates are coming and they're pushing, organizing parents on the outside. The win is that you have people, you have actually a place for them at the table, at the governance table, that they're part of running this system, that they are the thing that keeps the needs, and that they are accountable to their base, right? Not like the one special parent who's floating around, like someone who really, like, that's what we need to move towards, right? A co-governance model. Elizabeth, that's awesome. Thank you.
Rhonda, can I say one more thing, Rhonda?
Sure.
Thank you. Just thought I'd ask. And so with that in mind, knowing that, you did that beautiful presentation again, where we went from the red to the green, right? To show we want to make this,
that's right,
make this shift. It has to be a paradigm shift.
Exactly.
When you talk about shifting the culture, I like how you said the SPPP, shifting power, policy, and practices.
Exactly.
We can't shift if we don't have a parent voice at the table.
Absolutely.
We can't, because government's been shifting and we're still at the same place.
Yeah. That's I mean, and that's the PPRC, the power, policies, resources, culture, like, is so essential. And that's why, you can't, it's like, so yes. And what that implies is powerful parent voice at the table, who can hold systems accountable to really the folks who they are there to serve. And you're right. I'm going to make sure that's more central the next time I do this presentation. Otherwise, like, it is a complete shift in paradigm about who you're accountable to, right? About who is prioritized, about whose voice matters.
Yes.
And Tia, can I also chime in? I think this is a conversation we continue to have as we're doing the work in the county system, as well as with school districts, is really thinking about it in a different way of not just having, like Tia said, or I don't know, Elizabeth, if you were the one that said this, but not just having the same parents at the table, but really rethinking about how do we bring communities of our families together, and not necessarily look at it from the focus group perspective, but really looking at it as how do we build their capacity? How do we get them to a place where we really help have them have their voice and give us feedback through the entire system? And so not only are we looking at it from a perspective of parents in schools, but also how do we ensure that the parents are coming in or families are at the center with the entire county system, all the county agencies. So I think that is the work that we'll talk a little bit about that on June 16th, but I think many folks, when we say we want parent voice, what we tend to do is just go out and get focus groups or get the same people at the table. So just really wanting us to rethink the way we do work around that.
Yeah, and some folks mentioned in the comments, LCFF, school site councils, and it's true, we do have, like, there are some pathways, right? And there are some governance structures, right? I would argue that they aren't really power sharing structures, right? They're input structures, but they don't really, you don't have, the parents don't have power. And this, to build on what Rebecca said, the model where you just say what parents can do it, the parents who are going to be able to do it are the parents with more resources, because they're not overwhelmed with the 3 jobs and all the other stuff happening, right? And they're probably going to reflect a certain segment of folks. What you want to do, there are groups out there who are going year to year on almost no money, organizing parents. So think of who your PICO affiliate is. Who's your faith-based organizing group, right? Okay, they have come out of a tradition, a 70-year tradition of organizing folks in neighborhood to advocate powerfully for the needs of their folks. Okay, so it's like, so thinking about how you can couple with these groups that have been doing the consciousness raising, that have been building the advocacy skills, that have already been doing that work specifically among folks most impacted. And PICO is a big faith-based organizing network throughout California. You know, IAF is one in Texas, Industrial Areas Foundation, right? So in other words, cadre is something that isn't faith-based, but it's in other words, there are groups that are doing this already. Partner with them, okay? As opposed to thinking that you are going to have to actually build all these skills on your own. Like you're going to train all the parents, right? There are other groups that can do it in a powerful way. Partner with them.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Seth. With the climate of today demanding police reform and alternative ways of dealing with injustice and inequality, does this seem like the opportune time to promote these solutions and actions?
Absolutely. I saw that come up. That was on, yeah, we have a window here. Okay, this is a powerful window. We haven't seen in over 50 years a movement across race and across class pushing for racial justice. We haven't. This is the moment, okay? This is the moment, and it's been building. This is so different than 2014 in Ferguson, right? Because we've spent that time preparing, building our strength, having a platform, having demands, having allies, right? Raising consciousness. So this time you have folks out there who've made this opening. Push it within your organization and in your public systems. Right now don't be timid. Ask for everything that you want, right? This window will close.
Make sure you vote at all levels. We just have to keep pushing that because that's so important. Okay, oftentimes once students are suspended and placed in alternative placements or non-public schools, they don't make it back to comprehensive school sites. there's usually not a pathway back.
Yep.
Are there any districts that have policies that create that pathway back for students? And this is from Marcus.
So I actually don't know enough. I know, so New York State has a much more robust, powerful system of alternative schools than we do. And they have a system, so this is so central about like, there's no, once you leave the system, the traditional schooling, there's no pathway back, right? And that's because literally the continuation and community day schools in the legislative code, in the ed code, have been designed as dumping grounds, right? And by definition, you don't take what you threw away back, right? But this is, I think I would love to open it up. If other folks have examples, because the thing about alternative schools is, overall it's a setup. The system is setting up those schools. But you also find amongst all of these schools that are struggling, the most amazing kind of bright spots, right? Because the folks who are committed to teaching, like you get just these powerful principals and teachers who are just giving it their all. The fact though is that that's not a system solution, that's just that's like a hero solution, right? But still, those heroes have created examples, have created models that we could scale. So I would put it back to the group, because if other folks know of any district that's done a better job at creating the pathway back, that would be really, really important.
And I'll chime in. I think across the state, there's a lot of county offices that lead the charge around, or at least lead alternative education. And one thing that I have found has been that there needs to be, I've not found yet the best system in which we do get our kids back into the comprehensive high school. I think what tends to happen is just like our kids who are having significant behavior challenges, when they are put in a smaller school environment, they actually stay there because resources are there for them. What tends to happen is there's not an alignment or conversation that happens with the comprehensive school and the alternative ed school district or school site or system. And so how do we begin to have those conversations and begin to ensure that there's systems that ensure we are moving our kids back into those other school sites or back into the comprehensive school sites? So I think there's still a lot of conversations that need to happen. I would love to actually take a look at what New York State is doing, Tia, because I think that's something that our California state needs to be able to do, is explore other states that are doing this well.
Yeah, we've done some. I mean, part of it is that we have a terrible accountability system, right? And we did about 2 years ago. We made some important changes around 5-year graduation rates, because basically, like if for a high school, if you got someone who's coming in as a junior and is super behind in credits, super in credit deficit, you're going to eat that, because they're not going to finish. They don't have time in those 2 years to finish it. And so the incentive is to pass that off and put them do what's called an involuntary transfer, a strong suggestion, right? A very strong suggestion that you should move out, okay? And so one of the things that the California legislature did was to make room for 5-year graduation rates, so you could hold the young person another year, right? So it removed that. Also to tie the kids' graduation to that home school, right? So even if they go to the alternative school, this is who it still counts for you. Some of these changes are important. Now, it's really hard though for alternative schools. On the flip side, those alternative schools that have gotten really good at sending kids back, what happens to them, right? The kids who are achieving and would bring up their test scores and help them, look good on the accountability, they want to push them back out, right? Back to the school system. So they actually suffer, right? So the incentive would be to hang on to the kid who's doing well. So those are great questions. There's a lot of redesign work that has to happen on the alt school side.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes and 3 questions left. So the first one can actually be combined with the second. Says, should we promote or implement the anti-bias education and anti-oppression in all school settings and with parents. And I'll just add the second one as well, just so you can probably give a broader answer. It says, how does implicit bias perpetuate the school to prison pipeline? And what steps can educators take to combat that implicit bias that causes Black and brown students to be disproportionately affected?
Okay, could you do the first one again?
Yeah, the first one was, should we promote or implement anti-bias education and anti-oppression in all school settings and with parents?
Okay. Yes, I'll do the implicit bias one. I know we have 3 minutes here. So is there anything y'all need to do to wrap up? I just want to make sure, Tia, that we're okay.
Maybe just give us 1 minute to wrap up. So,
Okay. So implicit bias is a huge driver. Like, this can't be understated. The research that I mentioned, research out of Stanford, right, where they basically recruited teachers off of school websites, and then they brought them in and they read them they gave them actually a file, a California school a discipline record for a middle school, right? And they say, you got this kid in your class and it's a boy, and this kid has done some minor act of misbehavior, right? And they describe it, right? And then they would ask the teachers, okay, so how much does this interfere in your ability to kind of keep order? How much how irritating was it? How should it be punished, right? How severe a punishment should it get? And then they say, well, guess what? 2 weeks later, he does it again, right? So another act of minor misbehavior, talking to people, throwing paper, that kind of stuff, right? The stuff that really interferes with your teaching, right? Does it again, they go through the whole same thing, and they ask the same questions, how much did this interfere? How irritated are you? How would you punish it? Okay, so there's always a trick to these, and the trick here was you got randomized to one of two groups, okay? And in one group, the boy's name was Greg or Jake, and the other group, the boy's name was, now I'm gonna blank on this, it would basically identifiably, Darnell, that's what it was, Darnell. It was an identifiably African-American name, okay? So that was the only difference. There was no difference between the two groups. And then they compared the results, and this is what they found. After the first act of disobedience, there was no difference between the people who got Greg and the people who got Darnell, right? Like, no difference. It was after the repetition of it. It was after the second offense. The name of this article is 2 Strikes and You're Out. After the second one, you see a Black escalation effect, okay? So for the kid with the identifiably African-American name, the teacher now perceives the exact same behavior as more interfering in their teaching, right? As more irritating, as more severe, and they recommend harsher discipline. They also are more likely to label the student a troublemaker and to say they can imagine suspending them later. And the deep thing is, all teachers did this. Black teachers, Latino teachers, white teachers, everybody did this. So there are a group of, we are in the process, I think, as a field, of getting the right kinds of training. The important thing to remember about the implicit bias is there's lots of like these de-biasing kind of programs. I think probably the answer to implicit bias is relationship, okay? The only thing we know that consistently overcomes implicit bias is meaningful relationships, okay? And I don't have time to go into all that research, but what we have to do is design schools to be centered on relationships, design schools to reward relationship. And right now they punish it, right? You got your pacing guide, you got all this other stuff to do, right? You don't get rewarded for building deep relationships. When you build deep relationships, you stop relying on those automatic circuits that are impacted by implicit bias. And so there's a lot of things that the principal can do, that the teachers can do in structuring their day, to figure out how to not be in a state of mind where you're more likely to go to the automatic. Okay.
All right, well, we're actually out of time. Thank you so much, Tia. I'm gonna turn it over to Rebecca to wrap us up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, again, thank you, or we wanted to thank you for being a part of the call. I think we were at 94 pretty much all through the presentation. Was pretty awesome. We will be presenting again next week on June 16th. And so my hope is that Tia will give you guys, or send out the link for all of you guys to be able to register. So thank you so much.